Hello, everyone. I hope you have all had a great week this week, and we're looking forward to discussing our topic, which is examining culture in higher education. Sarah Feick and I have been working really hard together to make sure that we come up with something that's engaging for you all. And the presentation today is a little bit long. It's running right at around an hour, but there was just so much to cover in chapters 15 and 16 that we felt it was a little bit of an injustice to cut it any shorter. So I apologize for the length, but we do look forward to engaging with you all. Now, very quickly, I'm going to run through just a presentation outline today. I'll be going over chapters 15 and 16, trying to dig a little bit deeper into some of the topics that we've seen and making sure that we're relating everything back to higher education. I'll then be presenting the class exercise for this week. It's going to be one that's going to call you to pull from your own experiences in higher education, whether that be as a student or as a faculty or staff member. And then Sarah is going to go over Articles 1 and 2 and then discuss the thought papers with you all. So let's jump right on in. When we begin looking at the foundations of organization structure, one quote really stands out in the text. And that quote is just this. It occurs on page 249 if you're following along with us. Organizational structure is far more than simply deciding who's the boss and how many employees will be needed. That is essentially the most rudimentary, basic description that you can give of organizational structure. And when we really dig deeper in, as we're going to do in just a moment, you can see just how complex these systems can really become. So there are 6 elements of organization structure, those being work specialization, departmentalization, chain of command, span of control, centralization, and formalization. Each one has very specific uses. Each one has various strengths and weaknesses, all of which we will address in just a moment. So to start with, we'll begin our discussion by talking about work specialization or division of labor. And so a quote to go right along with this, if you're following along again, is page 250. It just says the degree to which activities within the organization are divided into separate jobs. So throughout the 1960s, really most of the 20th century, we see large companies, the book specifically talks about Ford, able to create vehicles very, very quickly because they had the division of labor or the labor divided into extremely small, minute pieces that all worked together to create a more uniform whole. And this worked well, like I said, until the 1960s when we as kind of the American workforce basically grew bored. We were no longer okay with coming to work and performing the same task over and over and over every day. We stopped drawing quite as much satisfaction from that, and so we no longer simply wanted to perform that one task, and as such we started to see productivity suffer. And so after the 1960s, we really started to see a movement toward a more team-oriented setting. And so this is where our discussion on departmentalization really begins. Now, departmentalization can be defined by a quote from Robbins and Judge that appears on page 251. It just says departmentalization, once jobs have been divided through work specialization, as we discussed on the last slide, they must be grouped so common tasks can be coordinated. Now, you're not going to find this particular piece in the text, but colleges and universities are poster children for departmentalization. We have departments for everything. I'm willing to bet most of all of our jobs fit somewhere into a department. It's almost how our reporting structure is built. And there are several forms of departmentalization that the text talks about. And first is specialization. So we're taking all of the people, the one that I like to think of as public relations, all of the people that can talk that talk, can walk that walk, have a little bit of maybe design background, that kind of thing. They're all specialized to deal with today's media, and so we group them together and call them the Department of Public Relations or Exterior Affairs or whatever it may be. Much the same, we can group people by the product or service that they provide. Now, again, PR can kind of sit in that same sort of realm there. Then you move down a little farther, and it changes a little from higher ed, but you see things like geography or territory. They kind of work together to me. But you see like sales jobs, or even some working back to higher education, seeing some of our admissions folks broken into geography or territories where I know ABAC's admissions team is split into, I think, 5 different sections. And so, like, admissions coordinator, counselor 1 covers all of the North Georgia area, and then another state. So that would be their specific territory. And then process basically just says that things that are close to each other need to be close together in the workplace. So if the cashier's office and financial aid are next door to each other, their overall process, just because financial aid is dealing with money, the cashier's office should be relatively close by, just so that in the process of getting everything paid for, we make it as easy as we can on the individual that's trying to take part in that process as a whole. And then lastly is going to be type, and the one that the text describes is actually Microsoft. It just states that they're split into 4 separate types, the actual business. And so those would be consumers, large corporations, software developers, and small businesses. And so if you work with some of our grants or contracts, you can see where higher ed would fit in with some of our private partners outside of higher ed, where we would fit in as maybe a large corporation, or even strictly as a consumer. I know specifically for ABAC, we have contracts with Enterprise, we have contracts with actually the Walmart in town, we have contracts with Staples in town, so all kinds of stuff like that. So grouping things based on the type of organization that we're dealing with as well. Now, next up in our discussion is going to be chain of command. And I'm going to continue with this theme of starting with the quote here, but on page 252, the text describes chain of command as being an unbroken line of authority that extends from the top of the organization to the lowest echelon and clarifies who reports to whom. In this discussion, we have to also specifically talk about authority and unity of command. You can't really talk about chain of command without first identifying what those 2 words mean. And so authority specifically is the right of an individual in some managerial position to give an order or a command and expect that that order be obeyed. So that authority or organizational authority, you can specifically see in maybe your department heads, the leaders of your institutions. When they say something or they give you something to do, a task, they just sort of expect it to be done. So that's the organizational authority there. Now, unity of command is a little bit different, but it essentially says that a person should have one and only one superior to whom he or she is directly responsible. If that's broken, you can have lots of issues with conflicting demands or priorities from several different supervisors. Basically just saying that you should really only have one direct supervisor to whom you answer. You shouldn't have 2 or 3 supervisors. This is something of an issue that we see in residence life. We see some buildings across the university system that will have multiple residence life coordinators. Causes issues for the student staff. They learn to play against their supervisors' weaknesses, and it's always not exactly a good thing. But the chain of command system works much differently than in years past, and on the whole, this is due to the general level of access to information that we have today. So just picture being an employee at some large higher education institution in the 50s, where you didn't really have any extra access to maybe where the president is today or what the president's meeting schedule looks like. You can't just, for us, check on Google Forms and look and see, what their calendar looks like today. The access to information that we have is much more, I guess, involved now. And so the chain of command almost has shrunk. Really, really interesting to compare, I guess, today's chain of command versus in the past. But I think this is the biggest weakness of the chain of command system is that a lot of the good ideas start at the bottom. And in the chain of command system, it's almost, I guess, looked down upon for the people on the bottom to really speak up and be giving those, I guess, the input and ideas. And so with many of the good ideas existing at the bottom, breaking that down a little bit can really give us a good place to start when it comes to increasing the efficiency or bettering our organizations as a whole. Now this next topic, span of control, is actually going to be fairly short, but it's really, in a nutshell, basically just talking about maximization of efficiency and trying to figure out how many employees a manager can oversee while still being effective. And so there's a figure on page 253 of your text that really talks about balance, and you see essentially what is an example of how changing the number of people that are reporting to you can affect efficiency. That's a really good spot to go take a look at. It starts off with a group that's assuming a span of 4, just meaning that one person would have 4 people reporting to them, and then the other is assuming a span of 8, meaning one person would have 8 people reporting to them. And it gives you an example of just how different that, what seemingly is a small change, affects the entire organization as a whole. Next, as we begin our discussion on centralization and decentralization, I think it's important for us to first define centralization. And so in my own definition, I just sort of define it as the degree to which decision-making power, or decision-making in general, is concentrated at a single point of power. And so in a centralized organization, we're looking at the power structure being very, very much focused on the top. Mostly 1, 2, 3 people at most that have all the power, and then everybody below that pretty much just follows the decisions that are made at the upper level. Now the decentralized power structure is essentially going to be the opposite of that. The power is going to rest with the managers or even some of the workers, almost a more democratic sense there, where the power really rests with the majority of people. And I ask you this question, where do you feel that higher education lies on this scale? Because I don't think we are really a centralized system, but I don't think we're decentralized either. Most of the big decisions for our organizations are being made by the president and the cabinet. But a lot of times our decisions are being made by those with boots on the ground, those that are spending most time with students. We're being consulted on what to do, on how to move forward. And so just interested to see where you feel higher education lies. So the last point before we move on to the next topic, which is formalization, just a quick little tidbit here. Centralization as a whole is safe, but not necessarily effective. Whereas decentralization offers a much, much faster response time, but is not nearly as safe. And so what I mean is, if we're looking to like crisis management issues, right? We have a student death on our campus, or there's some ongoing problem, maybe hazing within the residence halls, big overwhelming issue, right? If we're in a centralized organization, really the only person that can make a decision on how to move forward is more than likely not going to be directly involved in the situation at that moment. They're not going to be right there where you can have access to them. Whereas in a decentralized organization, the person making the decision may be somebody at the entry level that does have the authority to decide what they want to do or how to move forward from there. But you can see how allowing the president or maybe the director of public relations or something to handle an issue in the public eye would change when shifted to somebody at a lower level. The level of risk definitely increases, but the response time is really what we're focusing on in the correlation between centralization and decentralization there. Now, the last of the key elements of organization structure is going to be formalization. And this is going to be the degree to which jobs within the organization are standardized. And so really here we're looking to answer this question, just how much autonomy does our employee have? And so in a high formalized or high formalization organization, we're going to see very, very high reliability. We can see the same response every time. We can expect very, very clear results. And so in jobs or organizations such as this, you'll see things like extremely explicit, well written out, very specific job descriptions, very well detailed organization rules, what is and what is not acceptable in the workplace, and then clearly defined procedures for how to do things within the organization. Now, in truth, this sounds great. I mean, we're getting the same results all the time. We kind of know what to expect. We're not going to be hit by any curveballs. But the downside to an extremely high formalized or formalization organization is that it really does kill flexibility and innovation. And so, if you don't have an extremely strong leader or set of leaders, you're not going to be getting any really new ideas or feedback coming from your entry level and really boots on the ground positions, because what their expectations are and what's expected of them is so structured that there's really not any room left for that innovation and that flexibility for employees. So there's an upside and a downside to formalization. And I think in higher ed especially, it's about finding that middle ground where we can get consistent results from our employees, but also if there's a new way to do something, we can still continue to evolve and update our processes and practices. Now, moving on from the processes or activities that sort of make up organization structure, we're going to look now to some common organization designs. And three of those that we're going to discuss specifically are going to be the simple structure, the bureaucracy, and then the matrix structure. So starting with the simple structure, you're going to see a very, very flat organization. Typically, there's going to be one individual with the majority of decision-making power. There's a very, very fast decision-making process in this model. Most organizations will start here and then evolve. And so what you're going to see here most often is going to be maybe your small organizations, your small stores where there's like the owner and the manager are the same person. So some of your downtown businesses, that kind of thing, are going to be that very simple structure. Again, this is going to be the starting point. And I think that the little graphic here is kind of funny, but in the simple structure, you really have a one-man band. You got somebody that's doing all kinds of different stuff within the organization. You got somebody that's really working hard, making sure that the thing is going to get off the ground and running before hiring and bringing other people in to really help. Now, the bureaucracy is going to be a little different from the simple structure because in this, standardization is going to be key, or specifically standardization is going to be the key thing that underlies all bureaucracies in general, but in this model specifically, the strength is going to be the ability to perform standardized activities in a highly efficient manner that's going to produce the exact same results. Now this sounds kind of harsh, and I hope you guys don't take it to mean that, but in this type of system you can get by with less talented employees because your job responsibilities are already laid out for them. They don't have really any autonomy in the position. There's little expected of them outside of like the task that the employees are assigned to do. And so as a whole, looking at it this way, this can be kind of a selfish model. Can create departments that are all about themselves. And so this is not necessarily a system that I would categorize higher education being in, but I have seen at some of your institutions, I would be interested to hear from you if you've seen this occur. You know, you see departments that really lose sight of the institution's overall mission, and so they're really only concerned with how their specific department functions rather than how their specific department functions with regard to the whole of the institution. We see this specifically at ABAC in our financial aid department. They're just the department head in our financial aid department does not get along very well with some of the other department heads, and so when it comes to doing community activities or opening late for something, we have a really hard time getting cooperation out of them. That selfishness kind of comes into play, whereas our financial aid department is running very well. When it comes to the cooperation with the rest of the institution, maybe not so much. So seeing that kind of thing in this bureaucratic system. Now, the matrix structure is where our text tells us that higher education is going to be categorized, and this is going to combine both the functional and product departmentalization as we spoke of earlier. So one of the strengths of this is going to be interconnected. Everything's connected to one another, so dissemination of information happens very fast. News about the way new things are going to be done, it all occurs very quickly. Very strong strength there. A weakness, however, is going to be keeping things on time and in budget. Just because there are so many people involved now, you're going to have power struggles, fights over human capital, some role conflicts. You get normal, I guess higher education problems that arise in this structure, but overall you see that strength being the dissemination of information, being a unity of institution, but it does break the concept of unity of command. Just because multiple departments may have multiple department heads, multiple people that you are answering to. Specifically in my own department, I have my direct report, which is our assistant director of residence life, but I also report to the director of residence life and dean of students, and then the vice president of student affairs and the president, and so on and so forth. And so yes, I directly report to one person, but that unity of command model is kind of broken because there's multiple layers to that. So seeing that matrix structure here kind of takes a little bit of everything that we've talked about so far, combines it together in kind of almost a messy way that can get kind of complicated, but this is where higher education institutions fall, and I'm excited to talk to you guys about that later on. So now that we've kind of laid that foundation, that was really the meat of chapter 15 there. But I do want to just make sure that I hit these really fast, some new and emerging design options that are coming up. And there's 3 that I want to talk to you. So first we want to look at the virtual network or modular organization. And so if you're following along, again, this is going to be on page 258. It's just defined as the virtual organization is highly centralized with little or no departmentalization. This type of organization is going to minimize bureaucratic overhead because there's no really lasting organization to maintain. Most everything is online. An example of this could be the movie business, where there's one central office and then you outsource the rest of the work. And so you're, instead of having like a centralized body where everything is located all in one place, you would have a centralized body that's very small, that has detached arms that can reach out and grab other organizations to pull in and use as needed. And so seeing that modular, that network approach, making sure that you don't have any more than you need and no longer than you need it for. Now next is going to be the boundaryless organization, and in essence this is kind of the opposite of higher education. And this is coined by Jack Welch, but the quote that I feel best describes this comes from page 259. It says, the boundaryless organization seeks to eliminate the chain of command, have limitless spans of control, and replace departments with empowered teams. So this type of organization really seeks to minimize status and rank, and I do think there's something to be learned here. It's very different from the way that we have things now, but with the status and rank removed, it's just something interesting to think about how that would affect organizational efficiency. I'm excited to talk to you guys about that in the discussion this week. And then lastly, and this one's really interesting, is the learner organization. And they're really categorized by one thing. That's going to be downsizing. It's the movement toward the creation of a lean, maybe flexible organization This really happens when things kind of get complicated in the organization. You see downsizing as a method for kind of uncomplicating things and making the overall process of running the organization a lot more simple. Strategies for this can be investment, so investing in high involvement work practices, communication or transparency, kind of letting employees know up front how the organization is doing, what's going on, breaking down those kind of silo barriers. Participation is another, allowing employees to participate and offer feedback in that process, really making them stakeholders in that process of downsizing. And then assistance. So once you're kind of decided that you're going to downsize, making sure that you're offering severance pay and packages, extended healthcare, job assistance, that kind of thing. Because in any learner organization that's going through that downsizing process, there are going to be employees that are going to be directly affected and hurt by that. And so the text specifically kind of offers some guidance on what that should look like for us. Now this is our last slide for chapter 15, but I want to quickly hit why our organizations differ in structure. And I think the three-word phrase that really kind of pulls in how we feel is just that structure accommodates strategy. Whatever we're trying to accomplish, our structure typically goes right alongside that to try and help us, or it should anyway, help us accomplish our goals. If a company values productivity and they kind of care less about employees, then they're going to go with that mechanistic model that's really kind of pushing them toward the end product. But on the flip side, if they value employee satisfaction, that kind of thing, the structure of the organization is going to go right along with that. So higher education we see is no different when we are specifically seeking after maybe increasing student involvement. Our structure changes. We'll add new positions and things that specifically work toward that strategy or that goal. So likewise, we see things like cost minimization strategies where the organization is really tightly trying to control their costs, or we see imitation strategy where an institution is trying to minimize risk and maximize opportunity, basically just trying not to reinvent the wheel. These types of organizations aren't interested in being the first in anything. They're interested more in the profit that they can make and the security that they have in that. And I guess lastly, size of the institution or organization really affects structure as a whole. A small organization, like 100 employees or less, can be organic with little trouble. They can have more of a fluid model because everybody's going to know each other, and you can disseminate information quickly because you don't have to tell that many people. But as you increase in size, a more mechanistic approach almost becomes unavoidable, inevitable in this case. So I hope you enjoyed our discussion on chapter 15, and we're going to move straight into chapter 16 now. So chapter 16 really changes things for us a little bit, shifting things from the structure of an organization to the culture. And this is where we're going to ask for some of your more directed response and activity here. And I think a good quote from the text comes from page 269, just states, "A system of shared meaning held by members that distinguishes the organization from other organizations." I couldn't find another definition for organizational culture that really fits any better than that. Now there are 7 key characteristics to organizational culture, and I'm not going to go deeply into any of these really because they're all sort of self-explanatory, but the first being innovation and risk. So how willing is the institution to take a risk, attention to detail, outcome orientation, people orientation, team orientation, aggressiveness, and that's a strong one for me. The text simply defines it as the degree to which people are aggressive and competitive rather than easygoing. So you see some of this in maybe our organizations in the country that revolve around like sales, that kind of thing, where there is some direct competition between group members. And then lastly is going to be stability. So those 7 characteristics can be found on page 269. I would recommend going and reading those if you haven't already. Very, very interesting to see just how the text describes those. Now, in describing organizational culture, we have to also talk about dominant and subcultures within the organization. So our dominant cultures are going to express the core values of our organization, and those don't necessarily go along with what our written core values are. These are going to be our core values that are truly at the root of our organization, that may be unspoken in some sense, but the real core values that exist. Now, subcultures are going to represent the values of each department individually. And so I'm speaking from ABAC's perspective again, but our department has very specific, core values or expectations. And although they do align with the entire organization's core values, they are not explicitly the same. So that subculture is going to look at those values. You can see some strong dominant cultures in organizations such as Google, Disney, Chick-fil-A, where there's an explicit expectation of how employees are to act and respond. Just excellent examples there. Now, weak culture is a little bit different in the sense that we are looking at institutions that maybe they, as I previously discussed, had or have core values that are very, very well published and whatever, but they're not exactly following those. And so that culture can almost be seen as a detriment to the institution, I guess because we're talking the talk but not necessarily walking the walk. And so seeing that weak culture there comes as a detriment to our organizations. Now, I think it's important for us to talk about what role culture plays on our campuses. And we talk about campus culture, and I think at some point, maybe it was during our first semester, we specifically spoke toward trying to define what campus culture means. And I ask you that question again. How would you define campus culture? And so on page 271, we see a quote there that just says, "Culture is the social glue that helps hold the organization together by providing standards for what employees, and for us, even our students, should say and do." And so this culture offers us a sense of identity. It facilitates commitment to something larger than just the individual. And overall, it enhances stability to the overall social system. So culture tells us almost how much we can bend the rules according to, that quote there, what, our expectations are, what our organization's expectations are of us with regard to ethics, with regard to behavior, with regard to customer service. It can really be applied to everything. So the role of culture on our campuses is really to set those guidelines for us, to set those roadblocks and barriers, to know what is and is not expected of us in the workplace. Thus far, I've spoken very, very positively about organizational culture, and I believe that culture can be a very positive thing. But that doesn't mean that culture doesn't come without its struggles as well. With the growing trend toward decentralized organizations that we've seen, loyalty can really come into play, where we can see maybe employees, as we talked about earlier, feeling more loyal to maybe their department than the organization as a whole. I've talked about the example with our own financial aid department, and I'm willing to bet there are things like that in your own institutions. If we move back into the private sector, we can see where maybe money would be more important to some than perhaps customer care. We see this in healthcare sometimes. So struggles with culture do occur. Another, struggle overall would be organizational fit. So when you're interviewing for a job, any of you, any of us at all really, especially at higher levels, one thing that we're really doing is we, as individuals, are interviewing the institution just as much as they are interviewing us. And this process does have a name, this organizational fit. The text calls it a process for us to measure our individual to organization fit. The text specifically describes this on page 271. And it tells us that this premise works in reverse as well. And so institutions are also looking to see if you or us or whoever, if we're applying for a job, is going to fit in with their organization. So it's working both ways, not just us examining the organizational culture of the institution, but the institution itself examining what we're going to bring to that organizational culture to make sure that we are going to fit as well. I'm going to go through this next side really fast. We're going to talk about organizational climate. Robbins and Judge define organizational climate as something that refers to the shared perceptions organizational members have about their organization and work environment. That occurs on page 272. And this is an aspect of culture, but not culture itself. So we see something like maybe team spirit being an organizational climate. You know, how much, like specifically if I'm using ABAC, how much our students go out and support the baseball team or the soccer team or tennis or golf or whatever it may be. So you can visibly see that support, but the climate can change much more quickly than the culture itself can. So the book, again on page 272, talks about one meta-analysis that found that across dozens of different samples, psychological climate was strongly related to employee job satisfaction, involvement, commitment, and motivation. Basically showing that a positive workplace climate, somewhere where people enjoy coming to work every day, naturally has been linked to higher customer satisfaction and financial performance as well. So not only is organizational climate creating that positive organizational climate important for the employee, but it's also important for the business as well. So that is to say that culture can be a liability. Culture in an institutionalization sense can have negative effects as we're taking away from the goods and services that we're providing if we're focusing too much on it. It can be a barrier to change since we get used to doing things a specific way all the time. This is how the University of North Georgia has always done something. That culture can be a barrier to changing things. Additionally, and this one's really important, so I'm going to spend a second here, it can be a barrier to diversity. And this was a really neat portion to read, still on page 272 if you'd like to flip back over there to it. But essentially we're looking at what comes out to be an assimilate or eliminate process. If an employee comes in, gets hired, and doesn't necessarily fit with the organizational culture, really the individual has the opportunity to assimilate or leave. And so in a sense, we're almost running off different points of view than what we want. And so really interesting there when it comes to being a barrier to diversity, especially if you look at a culture and an institution that might somehow directly or indirectly support bias, insensitivity, or prejudice. Really interesting read there. And then lastly, barriers to acquisitions and mergers. And so specifically, I'm going to, Haley, ask if you could speak to this maybe in your response. But the text states that in the past, the main factors in creating and forming mergers were product synergy, financial advantage, really focusing on the business side of an organization when it comes to mergers. But now we're seeing that culture has to weigh into that decision as well. So when I'm thinking about what that looks like, I'm thinking about Georgia Southern and Armstrong. On paper it looked like a really good move, but I just feel like at the institutional level for the students, faculty, and staff there, the two just didn't really mesh well. They didn't have the same core values. The student populations were different. And so, Haley, that may be something that you can speak more toward, but basically showing that the two cultures, the one of Georgia Southern and that of Armstrong, didn't mesh super well, so it caused a little bit of friction and decreases in overall efficiency is what the book is telling us. Now this is our last slide before I get to our class activity, and it's specifically going to talk about creating and sustaining culture. So in order to do that, we need to talk about how culture begins, and it really begins with the founders who started the organization. These individuals are free from history, just meaning that they're not bound to anyone else's rules. They're making this up as they go along. They're leaning on the knowledge of obviously learned others, but they're the ones setting the tone for those to follow. There are really, I guess, three, as the text puts it, three methods for culture creation. And one of those is going to be the founders hire and keep only the employees who think that they'll feel that they'll do things the same way. Again, those are the people free from history. Indoctrination is another one, and that sounds absolutely terrible, but the founders, the original starting members, find and socialize and indoctrinate new employees to their way of thinking, their way of feeling, their way of doing things. And then the last one, which is my personal favorite, I've called it servant leadership. That's not what the text calls it, but the founder's own behavior creates and encourages employees to identify with them, internalize their beliefs, values, and assumptions. And so their leading by example really starts to create that culture that's going to last. The servant leadership there is the one that I see is the one that's going to leave the largest impact. Now, keeping a culture alive is a little bit more difficult. There's a lot more to it, really, but can be maintained in several ways, I guess. First of all, can be similar experiences, and so offering similar experiences in the selection process, performance evaluations, training and development, promotion procedures. These systems will always naturally reward those that follow the culture and will also degrade those that do not. And so in sustaining culture, making sure that you have some similar experiences across the board, that no matter what department you're a part of, looks a lot like, or are very, very similar throughout the organization. Next is going to be your top level management, and this can be through words, behavior. These senior executives are the people that really establish the norms for the institution. These are going to filter through the organization. And so these norms can be risk-taking, overall freedom of employees, appropriate dress. This is one that we see across the university system and in different departments. In my department specifically, it's not inappropriate for us to wear jeans on days where we know that we're going to have a lot of interaction with students. That is not going to occur in our office. So if we're out and about walking around campus, it's not inappropriate for us to wear jeans and like an AVAX shirt. That's just kind of the socialization, the expectation for us. And then lastly, the actions that earn pay raises, and that doesn't necessarily come so much in higher education, but we see in some of our private partner organizations where certain actions and behavior can be rewarded with those pay raises. And then lastly, we see metamorphosis, which is, I need to back up one, don't I? Socialization, which is the term for helping a new employee get acclimated to the organization's culture. This happens in 3 stages. It's going to be a pre-arrival, encounter, and then metamorphosis. And so the pre-arrival itself is going to be the research that we do before we get to the institution, figuring out if we think, even before we interview, if we're going to fit in there or not. The encounter is going to be the employee seeing the difference between their pre-arrival expectations and kind of the reality of how things are. In some cases, this stage will reinforce that decision to join the organization. And on the flip side of that, in some cases, this is going to discourage them. In situations when the two don't match, the pre-arrival expectations and the encounter, it can really cause new employees to go as far as to even quit their job and try to find something else to do. And then lastly, metamorphosis is where the employee really starts to sort out any problems they may have uncovered during the encounter stage. And this stage would be where the employee kind of changes their norms to fit in with the institution as a whole. So in that, kind of creating and sustaining culture from a top level manager perspective, really the things that we can do, in my own mind at least, especially supported by this text, is to lead by example. How do you want your employees to act in the workplace? Is there something that they're doing or not doing that you really want to change? The best way to do that is for you as their supervisor, as their manager, to get out and show them what to do and how to do it. Don't boss them around. Don't, order them around. Go out and show them what this is supposed to look like. And that will go pay large dividends toward creating the culture that you want to have in your workplace. So now for what I am sure is your favorite part of the presentations each week. I'm not actually going to ask you guys to do any extra work. I'm just going to ask you to put something inside of your response this week. And so I just kind of thought this image was neat, but let's cut into some of this and kind of see what this looks like at your own institution specifically. So employees really learn culture in multiple different ways. I'm going to highlight four, and the first of which is stories, and that's kind of what I'm asking of you to do during our activity this week. Is just share with us a story about your institution or a time at an institution that you really felt led you toward understanding or getting on board with the campus culture that you felt there. And so 3 ways specifically that I want to look at are going to be rituals. So the text defines these as sort of repetitive sequences of activities that express and reinforce the key values of the organization. An example for me is going to be maybe our school chants. So what are examples of your institution's team spirit rituals? What do you guys do? What are your chants at your institution? What are some things that make your institution uniquely yours that are, strictly UNG or UWG or UGA, ABAC, Georgia Southern? What are y'all's rituals that you carry with you regardless of where you're at? The next thing is going to be some material symbols. And looking specifically at almost like the way your campus is laid out. And so when I think about this, I think about like our physical office spaces. What do those spaces say? And how does that change when you go from office to office or space to space? So like when you walk into your Dean of Students office, what environment does it feel like there? When you walk into your office, what does it feel like there? And so my second question for you all is, what are ways that you can decorate or arrange your office or department to give it the feel that you want when we're setting things up for our campuses? And the campus that I think of most with this is actually Mercer University in Macon, Georgia. You can't go anywhere on that campus without being flooded with the Mercer Bear. And they do this on purpose. It's to get you really bought into that physical symbol there. But, we're not out here spending all that money to make our whole campus look like that, but you can rearrange your own office space to make it say what you're wanting it to say. And so what do you do in your own office space to get that feel that you want? And then lastly is going to be language. So these are going to be common terms that the entire institution uses. Every institution has something like this, and the one I'm going to pick on is going to be actually a University of North Georgia phrase, but the UNG campus, at least in Dahlonega, calls the dining hall chow. This was something that I got into a long conversation with a UNG employee about. He went back and forth on whether it was chow or the chow. I believe it is chow, personally. But this ties directly back the University of North Georgia's Dahlonega campus to their military background and roots. The connection there being deep rooted with the military influence on the campus. And so moving to the activity this week, in your response this week, please include one example of each of these forms of culture creation on your home campus. If you're working outside of higher education, please provide an example of something that you've noted in your own line of work, or even during your time in higher education. So again, one ritual that you have at your institution, one material symbol that you think maybe you can control on your own or that your institution employs widely, and then some language that you guys use that kind of set something back toward the institution as a whole.
Thank you, Trent, for going through and kind of helping us to collaborate a little bit more of our readings with some practical examples. This is Sarah Feick. I am now going to talk to you guys a little bit about the articles that we had that correlated with the readings for this week. So let's get started. The first article that I want to discuss with you guys is the Nike's Global Women's Fitness Business, Driving Strategic Integration. And this article particularly meshed well with that of chapter 15, which was discussing organizational structure and the changes that can occur within those structures and kind of how we see the organizations are laid out. So in 2006, Nike made a big structure change, and it wasn't necessarily big in the sense that they went from being one particular structure to a completely different structure. As a matter of fact, they really stayed, as far as when you discuss departmentalization, they stayed as a product departmentalized company, but they changed the way that that departmentalization looked very, very significantly. So previously, Nike had been set up as more of a product-driven structure where basically all of their workloads were divided by equipment, apparel, and footwear. And so they had each of these very segregated areas of the company, and what ended up happening was the design work that you would get was a little bit choppy. So the looks of the apparel maybe wouldn't match the footwear, or the footwear wouldn't match the equipment itself. So you had customers that were beginning to notice that they would go in to purchase things like footwear, and they would need shin guards at the same time, and they didn't match very well. Things just weren't meshing. And so Nike decided, hey, you know what? We need to make this move. Let's change to what was more of a consumer-driven structure is what I'm going to refer to it as. And the reason for that being that they basically changed to more of a sports structure, in addition to adding a specific women's fitness line. So they changed to basically, here is our soccer gear, and here is our football gear, and here is our lacrosse gear. When they did this, they also added in a specific women's line, because in the past, Nike had not had any specific women's apparel designers. What they had was basically what their men's group had designed, and they would take that and tailor it just enough to work as a women's line, but it wasn't ever specifically made for women. And they began to notice that that area of their marketing, that area of what they were selling, just wasn't really working well. And so they decided, hey, you know what, we're going to change it. Well, as all of you know, and as we've read throughout the week, any type of major structural change like this is going to create some substantial friction within the structure itself. So one of the biggest impacts that Nike found that this structure change had for them was that of the area of communication. As you can imagine, beforehand when they were in this product-driven structure, a lot of those different segregated areas didn't talk to each other. That's part of the reason they had the issue they were having. And so they had to begin to develop this new level of communication within their employees in order to actually get to where, hey, our soccer gear is somewhat coordinated and our football gear is somewhat coordinated and things like that. As far as hindrances that they found, obviously one of the biggest ones was the buy-in of the stakeholders. So you have people that are having to fund this and they're thinking, is this really going to work? Is it going to be beneficial in the long run? And that of the women's structure was really what ended up making it beneficial for Nike in the long run. That's how they kind of made their selling point to all of their stakeholders. In addition, you had the concerns over new team formation dynamics. So you had people, employees that were never working together in the past that all of a sudden had to work together. You had them being led by a completely different manager. You had managers that had such a different structure underneath them that they were having to figure out how on earth they were going to lead them. And so you ended up with a lot of this friction that comes with organizational structure changes. You had changes in the span of control of a lot of these managers, which is something that we had discussed within our reading this week. And you ended up with just having to kind of deal with the differences and the structural changes. One of the questions that this article particularly raised for me, though, when I was reading it was, I was curious how, because they moved kind of more to a specialization structure where, let's say that previously you were working on footwear, and yeah, that's pretty specialized, but now you've moved to soccer and footwear. And so you're literally all day making just soccer cleats, whereas maybe beforehand you were making soccer and football cleats. Our reading this week points out that when you get a little more specialized, you tend to see that employee productivity drop. And so part of my curiosity was, and it wasn't really spoken to from what I had read, was just how this change in structure could have actually impacted employee productivity. So I'd be interested in hearing what some of you guys have to say about how you might think that could have impacted it as well. So the next article that's presented is What is Organizational Culture? And this basically is an article that looks at how difficult it is to really define culture, how difficult it has been to put a pin and say this is exactly what organizational culture is. And it kind of discusses how there's actually some different viewpoints on, does culture really exist? Is it just something that we make up? Is it just something that is more emotional than what it is factual? And so here I'm just going to present to you some of the different concepts that they presented behind exactly what organizational culture is. So the first one that's presented is that culture is basically a result of consistency. So culture is just what those people in the organization are doing on a regular basis. And so this view really emphasizes that habits are what create culture, and it doesn't necessarily consider that of emotions or feelings as much as what we've seen in the past. Next, what's noted is that culture is impacted by incentives. So basically what we just said earlier is that culture is presented as what it is that people do on a regular basis, right? Well, what people are incentivized to do is what's going to ultimately impact what they do. And so as a result, those incentives are going to, in a way, lead what the culture is by leading what it is that those employees are doing on a regular basis. In addition, culture is basically the sense-making behind the organization. So think of this as culture explains the why the organization is what it is, if that makes sense. So it's kind of taking those areas where you're like, why is it that we do this? And it almost explains it as a result of the culture. So this next point also kind of falls under that sense making, where culture is the carrier of meaning. So culture is a little bit more about just more than just what is an organization, and tells a little bit about the why an organization is the way that it is. So for example, one of the biggest cultures that we have at the company that I work for is that it's known for being incredibly ethical, and just really, really, really takes into consideration anything that could have an ethical implication. And that is a result of what we have come from in the past, because we actually came from a point where we had a leader that was very unethical and almost cost some practitioners their licenses. And so because of that, what are we known as? Well, we're known as a pretty ethical company, but what's the carrier of meaning behind that? What's the culture behind that? And the why is because of what we've actually been through as a company previously. So next, culture is basically the immune system of a company, and it basically is what prevents any type of wrong thinking within the company. And this reminded me of the reading that we discussed with the ethical work climate being produced from a culture in a company, and basically just saying that because of the way that a culture is, it's in a way going to prevent some of those more negative behaviors of the other employees. Finally, they point out that culture is dynamic, when you're trying to nail down exactly what a culture is out of an organization, this is something that's going to be ever changing. It varies based upon the stressors that are from the intrinsics and the extrinsics of whatever's going on in the company. And so it's not necessarily something that we can specifically put our finger on and say, this is the exact culture. It's something that's going to be an ever-changing dynamic, and that's something that's really important to consider when thinking about how organizational culture might ultimately impact organizational structure and organizational change. Okay guys, we are almost through. This is our final section, and I just wanted to go through some of the common themes that Trent and I found while we were going through the thought papers that were provided for us this week, considering the reading and the articles that were presented. So one of the first things that I noticed is that almost every single person pointed out something about the chain of command. And what was funny to me was people pointed out frequently that the book actually says that a chain of command, like a strict chain of command, frequently doesn't work anymore and that it's not seen as often. But what I think all of us noticed is that that chain of command has pretty much been in place in higher education for almost as long as any of us have been in it. So it's still very much used in higher education, but it's interesting to me how many different people indicate that that chain of command is not maintained. So Ross mentioned that the unity of command is not always maintained, and Sabrina said that there's not always a clear chain. She actually provided what I thought was an interesting reasoning behind this break in chain of command, which was that the interested party distrusts or doesn't respect the established protocols. And I would have to agree with Sabrina. I think that most of the time when we break that chain of command, it's because we're not trusting that following it is ultimately going to get us to where we want to be. The next thing that I noticed with everyone's papers almost was also that pretty much everyone categorized higher education as being mechanistic in nature. And I thought that Ken brought an interesting point to this, and he actually pointed out that this was because traditionally we tend to attempt to minimize our costs, and being mechanistic in nature can actually assist with that. This was a little different from Elizabeth's point, where she kind of mentions that we have to be very well organized in higher education. We have to keep good charts, we have to keep good records, and so because of it, we tend to be a little more mechanistic in nature as a result. In addition, what was mentioned in several of the papers was downsizing, and higher education having to be a part of downsizing. And I think it's interesting to note that most people mentioned this in what was typically a cost-saving strategy. And so part of me wonders if downsizing being so prevalent in higher education might actually have something to do with that mechanistic nature of higher education, simply because, as Ken stated, there is the fact that, you know, when we end up being more mechanistic in nature, we're trying to save money, we're trying to do this, and so thus downsizing in trying to save money could also be a part of that. Next, I found it very interesting that everyone kind of pointed out that there's this individuality need in culture as much as higher education or any type of institution might have similarities. There's also this individual need. And I think that Haley said it well when she said that in general, cultures need to allow freedom of expression, because not all employees will be able to provide their best work if they're forced to organize their systems in a way that doesn't make sense to them. And I think this is such an important point to make, especially when we're talking about higher education, because at the end of the day, there's a lot of freedom. You know, if someone is teaching a course or something like that, yeah, you have to meet those academic requirements, but I think that in order to be able to organize the course in such a way that it makes the most sense to that instructor is going to really be beneficial when you're considering organizational culture. Finally, and really what I think is the biggest takeaway in all of this, is that culture and structure is not a one-size-fits-all situation, and it definitely is not a one-size-fits-all situation in higher education. There are so many facets that encompass culture and structure that there's no way we could take one thing and try and pin it on everyone. And I think it's also important to remember that those changes are dynamic in culture, and that because of that, that one size fits all is never going to be something that we're looking for, especially within a higher education culture.